Hello and welcome back to the reaction to part 2 of Oversimplified's Second World War video. The first part I thought was really entertaining, really engaging, as well as informative. I'm going to try and do the exact same thing that I done with the first part of the video, which is just watch the video and anything where it overglosses or oversimplifies the events, then I'll try and add and kind of build around that lack. Again, that's not a criticism towards the video in any way, it's just my way of trying to build upon what is already an outstanding piece of educational material. So without further ado, let's get into the second part. I'm really looking forward to this.
By Skillshare, an online learning community. Stick around until the end of the video to learn how you can get an exclusive deal just for Oversimplified viewers. So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns. Yeah,
and just quickly then, that's something that we really need to remember is, at the time, Britain and France are still global empires. And although France, mainland France, fell relatively quickly, a lot of their colonies still joined Free France, and Britain, of course, the British Empire, the contribution of the colonies and the empire from around the world can't be overstated. Particularly, you know, the contributions of Canada, of Australia, of New Zealand, the Anzacs, South Africa, then Northern and Southern Rhodesia, as well as India. India, of course, had the largest volunteer force, I think, in history. I might be completely wrong by that, but last time I remember reading something about the British Raj committed over 3 million volunteers for the war effort, which is, I think, puts it as the largest volunteer force in history, or at least in modern history. And so the contributions to the war effort made from these colonies of both Britain and France really can't be overstated. They were vital. And I think sometimes unjustly they don't get the credit that they actually deserve for their role.
On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Defensive Tripartite Pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude was put on full display.
Yeah, so that is the Winter War, as it's known, and it was kind of a disaster for the Soviet Union. So a little bit of basis was Stalin was absolutely paranoid that an attack was going to come, and I mean rightfully so. He was correct in the end. However, his paranoia also made him to make some utterly stupid decisions. So you already had the purges, obviously, purging of his officer corps, which ridded the Soviet Union of a large number of its competent military officers and generals due to general paranoia, which scarred the Soviet Union, I think, way into the Second World War. But also, they believed that the Finns would allow the Germans to march through Finland and then attack the areas around Stalingrad from the Finnish border. Of course, that's ridiculous, but the Soviet Union nevertheless believed that, and so they went to Finland and demanding that they secede miles of their own border and demilitarize it to basically ensure this didn't happen. The Finns, of course, though, being a sovereign nation, decided no, we're not going to do that, and so the Soviet Union invaded them. And if I'm correct, the Finns held out for a number of months, but the casualties of the Soviet Union was high. However, this war also allowed the Soviet Union to learn. So when the Soviet Union invaded Finland, the Finns wore white coats, they were apt at skiing, because the Finns learned to ski from a young age, whereas the Soviets wore brown coats, which stood out like a sore thumb in the snowy conditions. They were poor in logistics, and they learnt basically the failures of their own tactics to a certain extent. I won't say entirely, because they suffered some horrific defeats at the beginning of Barbarossa particularly. However, the Finns themselves needed to be commended because they held their line probably to the best of their ability. They're only a small nation, and they caused the Soviets tremendous casualties. That's actually where we get Molotov cocktail from, which was where they had petrol bombs, essentially. And Molotov was named after the Soviet foreign minister, Molotov. But eventually, after a number of months, the Soviets were eventually able to force the Finns to peace, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. I believe one of the Soviet generals remarked that the Soviets had only gained enough land to bury their dead in, because at the cost of around 25,000 Finnish casualties, if I'm correct, the Soviets lost around 130 to 150,000. So there's an argument also to be made that also emboldened the Germans in the Axis in invading Russia when they did, because they just saw them struggle against Finland, and to quote German general hierarchy at the time, they believed that if you kicked open the door, then the whole rotten structure would collapse, and that was in reference to the Soviet Union. The Germans, emboldened by their successes in France, in Poland, and seeing the Soviets' ineptitude, believed that all they had to do really was have a successful initial invasion of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union would collapse upon itself. Obviously, that didn't happen, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here, because this is just the Winter War. Our Barbarossa hasn't even happened yet.
In the end, they did force the Finns to sue for peace. Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans, and they all pledged their allegiance to free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure. Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine, so he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly.
So I paused a little bit early there, but Italy during the Second World War is a bit of a butt of the jokes, and I don't think necessarily unjustly. They vastly, they was vastly unprepared for the war that they was joining, and when you look at their military record, there is a lot of successive defeats. However, having said that, that's not necessarily down to the Italian armed forces themselves. It's more to do with their leadership. For one, a lot of the Italian generals and staff members were there not by virtue of their military career or their military aptitude, but were there because of their personal politics, which, when you create a military system where your generals are based around their political beliefs rather than their actual effectiveness, that's a recipe for disaster in itself. But the big thing here is logistics. Italy is not an industrial nation. It wasn't an industrial nation until way after the Second World War, probably until the 50s or 60s. Certainly was not an industrial nation at the time. And it just so happens that a lot of the Italian military simply didn't have the equipment or logistics to fight the war that they was getting into. I believe as well, when the invasion of Greece, you see it there with the Greeks pushing into Albania. That's because at the initial point of the invasion of Greece, a lot of the Greeks were better armed than the Italians that were attacking them. Again, it boils down to really Mussolini getting involved in a war that his country was nowhere near prepared for. And when you're fighting against Britain, who's a global empire in their colonies, France, obviously France's fall, but the fight was still very much in France, in Free France rather. And then later, obviously, when the Americans get involved, there's no surprise that the Italians done as bad as they did when their leadership was inept and they practically had no logistical supplies. Even their marine vessels, they had a tremendous navy in the Mediterranean that they couldn't really put to too much use because they lacked oil. Their oil, they were almost entirely reliant on their oil from Germany. And when Germany started running into fuel problems, you can only imagine what that had on for the Italians. So
began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe," and sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won. Churchill asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston. But you know what? Here, have some weapons. America began supplying the Allies with food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pykrete. You take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pykrete." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pykrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room. Then they tried to make a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea.
You don't have to be a tech YouTuber to get sweet deals on the stuff you find online. You just need to install Honey.
So again, remember adverts also help support the original creator, which of course, after this video, go over to the Oversimplified channel and show them some love. But yeah, I don't know if that's actually true. I might need to actually look at that because that sounds both hilarious and questionable that would be put. But yeah, the U-boat menace was... I don't know if you can hear that, there's an ice cream truck outside. Yeah, the U-boat menace was a menace. It devastated kind of Allied convoy shipping. And again, as I mentioned in the last video, without the Norwegians, when Norway was invaded and eventually occupied, without the Norwegian kind of convoys, there's a decent chance that Britain could have struggled, or at least had a lot less materials actually going to the mainland than it did. Because again, as I said, at the time of Norway's capitulation, Norway was in possession of the largest merchant fleet in the world. So, again, shout out to Norway. I have a few Norwegian friends who will be happy to hear that. But yeah, the U-boats were really a problem, both for merchant shipping and also for the Royal Navy itself. And it was only really with the cracking of the Enigma code that we was really able to start winning that. It was, yeah, the Enigma code and the invention of things like spy planes and radar to detect the submarines that really started to turn the tide. And at that point, the U-boats were losing far more of their own ships than they were sinking. But that's much later. At this time, with the U-boats causing their menace as they are, this is what the Kriegsmarine referred to as the happy time, where they were basically free to rule the waves and sink any ships that they were coming across.
In the end, Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat. Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt. Hey, that was pretty easy, so they kept going. Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece, so either join us or, be invaded." Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt.
Yeah, so I'm just going to mention this quickly as well. When the Italians invaded Egypt, they vastly outnumbered the British garrison that was in Egypt. I believe at the time there was only about 36,000 British and Commonwealth troops in Egypt, whereas the Italians were invading with a force far greater, of upwards of 150,000 to some estimates put it as over 200,000. However, when they initially invaded Egypt, and I forgot to mention this earlier, they stopped due to logistical problems, and they ended up stopping for months because they didn't have any logistics. And then, when the British counterattacked, that was called Operation Compass, and essentially over a 2-month period, British and Commonwealth forces were able to push the Italians all the way back to Benghazi, and with a force of 36,000 men, was able to utterly destroy around 7 Italian divisions, causing about, I think it was, or capturing over 130,000 Italian troops with a force of 36,000. And in those 2 months, they was able to advance all the way to Benghazi, capture over 130,000 Italian troops with a force of only 36,000. And in the end, they only lost 2,000 casualties, of which only 500 were fatal. And I mention this because I don't feel like the North Africa front gets the coverage or the attention that it necessarily deserves, because for a large part of the war, it was the main theatre. The Eastern Front hadn't existed yet. America was not in the war. Obviously, you had Japan in the Pacific, but Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor yet. And so this is the war, along with the Battle of Britain, really. This is the first major theatre. And again, it is a massive contribution of British and Commonwealth forces that are doing this. And again, that when Britain was able to push, or the British forces were able to push to Benghazi, it just coincided with when Britain sent troops to Greece. The moment that they sent troops to Greece to reinforce Greeks against the German and Italian invasion, Rommel and his Africa Corps arrived in Africa in some twist of fortunes, and that's when you see this pushing the British back to the Egyptian border, except from that tiny little blue dot, which I assume they're going to talk about Tobruk, because that's where the Australians and the Kiwis were able to hold out for months in a really commendable effort, and it utterly frustrated Rommel and the Italians because holding Tobruk denied the Germans, the Italians, that supply port. Instead, they had to be supplied through Benghazi, which was hundreds of miles away, which took a lot longer to get there.
And they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out! With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand, and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops. 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it. It's all over. But then it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring?" "No, keep going." "But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles." "That's fine, keep going." "We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift." "Perfectly normal, keep going." Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold, and the Germans were no match. They were now being pushed back. They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end.
Yeah, so that's kind of the joke, isn't it? Never invade Russia in winter. And again, it is something that people seem to forget, is the Germans did not invade Russia in the winter. And yeah, the winter played obviously a very important role in the Germans' defeat. But the main problem with the German invasion of the Soviet Union was logistics. And this isn't just the invasion of the Soviet Union, it's Germany in general. In the Second World War were always a race against time because they didn't have the natural resources to sustain that fight. The whole idea, again, of kicking open the door and the whole rotten structure falling through is because that was what needed to happen for German victory in the East. Was the Soviet Union had to capitulate within months of Operation Barbarossa, as it was called. Otherwise, the Germans would swiftly start beginning to run out of supplies. And that wasn't just because of the winter. I mean, obviously planning to bring winter equipment and stuff like that obviously only exacerbated the German situation. However, the biggest problem with Germany was their lack of logistics. It's a bit like when people bring up, well, they should have just made more tanks, or they shouldn't have made the Maus or stuff like that. They should have just concentrated more on the Air Force, especially after being devastated in the Battle of Britain, or they should have just made more X vehicle, whether that be the Panzer IV or the Panther, or later the Tiger, which is ridiculous in its own sense. But the problem that a lot of people seem to forget is Germany as well, before the war, was getting a large amount of its oil from the Soviet Union. And so obviously the moment that it attacks the Soviet Union, it's a ticking time bomb with Germany trying to do the best with what really resources they actually have. And so when Operation Barbarossa happens and the Soviets lose hundreds of thousands, if not millions of troops within the initial few months, and Germany's making these large gains, suddenly when the Soviet Union doesn't actually capitulate, Germany's then in a bit of trouble where they don't actually have the logistics to fight this extended war in the way that they thought they would. And this just went on to cause no end of problems. The winter obviously helped, but logistics was the core part. And obviously, knowing Stalin's personality as well, there was no way Stalin was going to balk at casualties and suddenly capitulate. I'm of the opinion that even had Moscow fell, Russia would not have surrendered. It would have been a massive hit, but Stalin, if anything's shown from history, was just almost as megalomaniac as Hitler, and simply losing Moscow would be a hit, but it wouldn't be the hammer blow that the Germans, I think, believed it to be. But yeah.
Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan.
Yeah, so just getting on to this quickly, is while all this was happening and Japan was invading China, the US actually put in sanctions, stopping the oil supply to Japan. And obviously, as said, a large part of Japan's reason for going to war was to gain natural resources that they didn't actually have on their home islands. And so when US kind of severed the tie of oil to Japan, Japan kind of had to react, otherwise they wouldn't be able to pursue their war goal. However, how they reacted was possibly one of the stupidest ways possible, because the Japanese idea of attacking Pearl Harbor was actually predated by a British raid on the Italian fleet, and that was the raid on Taranto, where a Royal Navy aircraft carrier deployed torpedo bombers and hit the Italian fleet at Taranto, where they blew up a large number of fuel depots. Another ice cream truck just drove outside. They just blew up fuel depots, and they severely crippled 4 battleships. 1 they put out for the entirety of the war, another 2 they put out for a year, and the other one had to be repaired for a few months, along with other secondary and screening ships. There's some debate on how well that actually affected the Italian Navy effectiveness in the Mediterranean for other reasons. As I said, the Italian fuel shortages kind of hamstringed the Italian Navy operational effectiveness. However, that provided kind of the framework for Pearl Harbor. However, the Japanese aim of hitting the US fleet in port was the idea that if they was able to take out the American Pacific fleet, it would take months, if not years, to rebuild that force. And so the Japanese viewed it as, if they was able to knock out the Pacific fleet in America, then it would force the Americans into a position where the Americans couldn't possibly declare war or engage in Japan, because Japan would have free reign of the western kind of seaboard. However, a vital thing that happened at Pearl Harbor was the American aircraft carriers wasn't at Pearl Harbor when the attack took place. As a result, while it done a lot of damage, the main things that it didn't hit was the fuel supply and the aircraft carriers. Those 2 things avoiding meant that the Americans in the Pacific was still very capable of fighting a naval war, and particularly the Japanese also underestimated the Americans' capability to fight on 2 oceans and their industrial capacity to replace and repair those losses sustained in Pearl Harbor. However, their strike at Singapore was one of the biggest military defeats for Britain during the Second World War, as Britain had these massive naval guns to be prepared for a seaborne invasion. However, what Japan done was they invaded through Indochina, so modern day Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, that kind of region, and then simply marched Singapore from the north, which caught the British there relatively by surprise, and hundreds of thousands, I think it was about 100,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered, and that's where they went on to sustain horrific things within Japanese prisoner of war camps.
They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon.
Yeah.
In the meantime, though, the Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been as staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up with them.
Yeah, the atomic bomb. And it's not only that, it's the same as Germany in the sense that not so much for Japan, because Japan didn't declare war on the Soviet Union, but Japan declared war on Britain and America. And remember, British Empire, again, it's a collection of countries at the same time, while also fighting a land war in China. And Germany at the same time also declared war on Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, all at the same time, while only being one country. When you look at it, when you take a larger step back, statistically, there is no feasible way that either country really could have won that war in a long, drawn-out engagement, which is what it became to be.
For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat," but Hitler said, No, you stay. The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing.
Okay, so quickly there as well. So obviously that's about Stalingrad, which is one of the most famous battles of the Second World War, and certainly one of the most bloodiest of the Second World War, if not the bloodiest battle of the Second World War, at least in the European theatre. And the thing is, the decision for Germany to strike at the Caucasus is a correct one. As previously said, Germany was severely lacking in oil, and so striking at the Caucasus to attain those oil fields is an extremely smart idea, given their sufficiencies. However, what happened at Stalingrad was kind of... I don't like to use turning points in history, because I feel like it simplifies things. But if you are going to say a turning point, it is November of 1942, which is when the 6th Army gets surrounded, and then they have to surrender, and that's nearly 250,000 Germans. That's around 200,000 or to 250,000 Germans taken prisoner of war in the encirclement of Stalingrad, and they attacked the weaker flanks of like the Romanians and the Italians. And obviously Hitler refusing them to withdraw massively hindered their... Well, it didn't massively hinder their ability at all. It completely nullified any of their ability to be combat effective later in the war. And the reason why I say November of 1942, because at the same time, while Stalingrad's happening, I wonder if it will show this, the second Battle of El Alamein's happening in North Africa, with Operation Supercharge. Operation Lightfoot gets stopped by Rommel, and then Operation Supercharge pushes Rommel practically all the way back to Benghazi. And at the same time, after the Battle of El Alamein, and as the Germans and the Italians are being drove back to Benghazi, as they're kind of getting towards Benghazi, and Tobruk and all that's been liberated already, American, British and Free French are landing on West Africa in Operation Torch. And it's from this point really that the Germans are sufficiently on the back foot going forward, because really from this point onwards it's the beginning of the end for the Axis in Europe.
Westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again. Then they were pushed back again. And finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa.
Yeah.
Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually, they sank a lot of them.
Yeah, so this is another huge... this is probably the most decisive naval battle of the Second World War, is the Battle of Midway. Because the American aircraft carriers, as previously mentioned, that weren't at Pearl Harbor, were kind of gathered in the Sea Fleet. And the Japanese aircraft that hit Pearl Harbor was also sent from Japanese aircraft carriers. And that's where it became almost like a chess game, where both Japan and America were trying to figure out how to get rid of the other's carriers without losing their own. And Japan obviously wanted to attack Midway. However, the Americans had been able to crack the Japanese code before the invasion actually happened. And obviously at the Battle of Midway, 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. I think the Japanese after this had maybe 1 left, 1 or 2. I might be completely wrong. Naval isn't exactly my specialty. But the point is, after the Battle of Midway, Japan's capability to fight an offensive war, or practically fight any war at sea against the US. Remember as well, not only the US, but it's also the British Navy, and also things like the Dutch Navy and stuff like that, are still roaming the Pacific. So Japan losing 4 aircraft carriers in the Battle of Midway completely hamstrings their capability to fight. And from this point onwards, the Pacific Ocean really belongs to the Allies. There are some other minor skirmishes and minor battles, but none really strike as hard as Midway, because Midway was the decisive naval engagement. I was getting my words out properly. Was the decisive naval engagement of the Second World War, because it completely hamstringed the Japanese capability to fight, let alone fight an offensive war, but really fight a naval engagement at sea.
It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. All right, said the Americans, we'll do it your way. Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. All right, said the Americans, let's do it our way as well. Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive, the likes of which the world has never seen before, invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came, as Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success. Then they began their movement.
So, the invasion of Italy, as previously said, that was called Operation Husky. And the reason why they kind of opened a second front was the Americans were adamant on an invasion of Northern Europe or Western Europe. However, Churchill and the British viewed that the invasion of Southern Italy or Southern Europe would be a better priority, because Stalin was kind of desperate for a second front to open for a long time, as he believed it would kind of, split the German forces, obviously. And again, as previously said earlier in this joke, Churchill genuinely did regard the Italians as the soft underbelly. He viewed that invading Italy would be far easier than an invasion of Normandy, and he spent a long time trying to convince the Americans to agree to this, and in the end it worked out, because by the Allies invading Sicily and then later Italy, it drew German divisions into Italy, which weakened them from both the eastern and the northern front. And then when this come in on D-Day, as we know it now, it just made the invasion slightly easier. And obviously D-Day was preceded by the Dieppe raid, and the deception particularly as well is interesting. So there's a huge number of different deception tricks. You had people in charge of fake armies where they had inflatable tanks and cardboard cutouts of armies doing manoeuvres around Dover, which I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor, which is here if you're not British or don't know geography, which is why they thought, because Calais is just here. And the reason why they thought that it would come for Calais is because this is the shortest stretch, really, of the English Channel from Dover to Calais. And you had inflatable tanks, you had cardboard cutout men and stuff like that, all to lull the Germans into believing that it would come at Calais. I think there's even a story that goes so far that the British, poor unfortunate airman, had died. And so what the British had done was they had got on his corpse, given him lots of fake papers, lots of fake information, different intelligence in briefcases and stuff like that, to make him dress up as like a British general or British official. And then they flew him over Gibraltar and then dropped him in the ocean in the Mediterranean. And the Italians picked up his body, saw it, passed that information on to the Germans, which basically all that intelligence and information was deception, saying that this massive, great big invasion was going to come at Calais. And again, it's just one part of the massive deception tricks that went into the preparations for D-Day. And of course, it also needs to be mentioned at the same time. We mentioned slightly earlier in the video about resistance movements and partisans. Particularly before D-Day as well, the French resistance also played a very important role, being orchestrated by things like the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. They also went round changing road signs. They went round sabotaging railways deeper from within France and the immediate areas, which, in combination with the paratroopers securing the bridges and also doing their own destructive tactics, greatly hindered the Germans' ability to react. And it's also almost a twist of fate as well, that Rommel, the Desert Fox, one of the most competent Axis commanders at the time, took this time to go and visit his wife in Berlin for her birthday, because he viewed the weather, he viewed it would be unfavourable for an invasion, and so he felt that it was okay to go on leave back to Berlin to see his wife. As it happens, the moment that he leaves, this happens, and I believe I don't think it's conjecture, but when the invasion actually took place, the person who was in charge of the European, at the Northern Europe kind of defence sector, also didn't want to phone Hitler because Hitler was asleep at the time and they didn't want to disturb him. And so therefore reinforcements weren't rerouted to deal with the invasion when it happened. And obviously you had the Americans invading on Utah and Omaha. Omaha particularly was one of the more heavily fortified beachheads, and the Americans paid dearly for it. The British also at Golden Sword met fairly heavy resistance, but the Canadians at Juno, they're kind of the standout performers of D-Day, because their beachhead was still heavily defended, but the Canadians were the only task force really that was able to succeed all of their D-Day objectives on D-Day. And again, I don't think that necessarily the Canadians get the credit that they probably thoroughly deserve, not only in the Second World War but in the First World War, things like Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele and stuff like that. Again, it drives home that this was a global conflict. It's not just Britain, America, France, Russia. There was people from all different walks of life involved in this, and this would be the beginning of the liberation of Europe.
Inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium.
Oh, and I forgot to mention earlier as well, during Operation Torch, when the Americans, French and British were landing on northwest Africa, which was held by the Vichy French regime, the Vichy French initially put up some resistance in things like Casablanca and stuff like that. However, after only a few hours, the commander of the region surrendered. He didn't. The fight really in the Vichy French didn't want to be fighting against their own countrymen, and so it was the region commander surrendering and ordering a ceasefire among his own Vichy French in Operation Torch. Originally, Vichy France wasn't militarized, it wasn't occupied by the Germans, and so after Operation Torch, and when the Vichy French commander surrendered and laid down their arms kind of thing, Germany suddenly realized that Vichy France had no fight in them. They had no desire to fight against their own countrymen, and if they wouldn't fight against the Free France, then obviously they wouldn't necessarily stand to the US or Britain. And so Germany then reoccupied Vichy France. I forgot to mention it earlier, but that's again the concept that Germany actually reoccupied Vichy France, and yet when the invasions of southern France began, there were no German presence, or very little German presence in itself. It kind of makes you wonder, well, they militarized Vichy France because they wouldn't stand the fight against French and Americans and British troops, and yet when they actually occupy it themselves, there are no Germans there anyway. Just a little tidbit for you.
In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end, and the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening...
Yeah, so the Battle of Arnhem and Operation Market Garden as a whole. So if you've seen the film A Bridge Too Far, it's an amazing film. It's based around the operation called Operation Market Garden, and the concept of that was that British, American and Commonwealth paratroopers would do this massive paradrop, basically, all over kind of the rivers flowing through the Netherlands, eventually kind of almost into the Rhine and stuff like that. And the whole concept was that these paratroopers would drop and secure a number of bridges, and at the same time while that was happening, Allied armour would be pushing through the bridges that they succeeded. It almost worked. It's regarded as a military failure, and a lot of things went wrong with it. It was disastrous, particularly for the paratroopers who jumped at Arnhem. And and that's where you get bridge too far. The other bridges were taken and held, but Arnhem particularly, there was SS Panzer divisions there, and there's some the radios didn't work, and the paratroopers were kind of dropped virtually unsupported. The armour got delayed, and large numbers of those paratroopers who actually dropped at Arnhem were either killed or captured, and so it's kind of viewed as a disaster. But again, it's at this point, it's still a disaster that's taking the fight to Germany, whereas a stark contrast to earlier in the war where it was almost the opposite. Whereas, again, from November 1942, Germany is sufficiently and decisively on the back foot. And this would be later, as I assume it will also talk about the Battle of Kursk on the Eastern Front.
The industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and I have just the trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again." He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying, "Surrender or be annihilated." When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin.
Yeah, so the Battle of the Bulge was very much like the Battle of Kursk on the Eastern Front. Kursk happened. The Kursk, if Stalingrad was the decisive blow in the Eastern Front, as D-Day was on the Western Front, then the Battle of Kursk is comparable to the Battle of the Bulge. Whereas in both cases, it's a desperate Germany throwing their weight at a point and hoping that they can somehow break through. At Kursk in particular, the whole idea was that the Germans would amass their armour and be able to try and break the Kursk salient. And they believed that if they were able to do that, then they might be able to achieve victory in the east, like pull victory from the jaws of defeat. However, it went disastrously wrong. And again, Kursk predated kind of the massive surge from the Soviets from the east. And at the same time, the Battle of the Bulge, it pushed the Allies back and almost took them by surprise. However, again, they got bogged down, logistics became a problem again, and all it was just throwing more lives away and just prolonged the conflict longer than it needed to. Well, I say needed to, it was Hitler in charge, so he wasn't exactly the most sane or level-headed of people. But the Battle of the Bulge, again, people like to view, oh, well, maybe if they was able to do what they done in the early war, it would have worked. And it's like, it wouldn't, because the German army at the beginning of the war to the state of the German army at the end, they're night and day. And all the Battle of the Bulge was, just as Kursk was just delaying the inevitable.
In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. 2 of the Axis nations had been knocked out, 1 to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the US ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice. Either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. America and the UK were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki.
Yeah, the atomic bombing of Japan is extremely controversial, and it still continues to be controversial to this day. The problem with it is people deem that it was unnecessary. There was a show of force. It was kind of showing off. Or some people even suggest it was a test of what the atomic bombs could do to actual targets. And I think those arguments necessarily aren't valid. I think they were a show of force to the Soviet Union, and they were a genuine test to see what destruction they could wreak with those weapons. However, it's difficult to argue the morality of it, because a conventional invasion of the Japanese homeland islands, arguably, in a lot of statistics show that it probably would have caused far more death and suffering to everyone involved. It would have doubtlessly cost tens of thousands of American and British lives, and Russian lives as well, because Russia was also invading Japan from the west. But it also caused massive casualties for Japan and Japanese civilians, because it would have just meant more bombing raids on cities. Conventional land armies necessarily aren't renowned for their amazing kindness to civilians. And again, the civilians in Japan, a lot of them were being trained and being prepared to die. You just need to look at some of the later Japanese designs for weapons. Japanese industry, again, wasn't brilliant, but they were preparing their civilians in whatever way they could to defend the home islands. And so the common argument to justify the atomic bombings is that they were terrible, but in the long run it probably preserved more life than the atomic bombings dropped. I don't know where I subscribe to either argument there. I think both are valid, but as I said, only we can know the effect that the atomic bombs had, because obviously the invasion didn't happen. But I feel like the argument that suggests that a conventional land invasion would have been more costly in lives for both Allies and the Japanese forces, I think that argument certainly holds weight. And it's something to remember that, trying to argue morality in war is sometimes difficult, or it's oftentimes difficult, because war inherently isn't necessarily a moral act. It's almost the opposite, is immoral. And so, it's just an important thing to try and remain kind of rational and logical when you're talking about these things, rather than trying to react emotionally necessarily.
The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their main aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage.
Bit of an
After
understatement.
6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press to display to the Japanese people that their Emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed. Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the first. In its aftermath, two major superpowers with two very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the two of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one. Wow, Churchill.
Yeah, okay, so that's the end of that video there. So again, a massive thank you to Oversimplified for just creating this video. And as always, please, the link will be in the description. Go over there, like, subscribe there if you haven't already. I don't know how you're watching this video if you didn't know about the creation of the original one anyway, but please go over there, show your support there, and obviously if you have some extra support to show, then I would very much appreciate it. I welcome comments, any welcome criticisms or critical feedback. I very much welcome. I'm new to this whole thing. I don't know whether I should maybe watch the video through first and then gather notes and then watch it again and then provide more accurate reactions, or do you prefer these types of rambly videos where I watch it for the first time and then I talk as it's going and I just kind of stream of conscious at you? But regardless, I've really enjoyed these two videos. I think they've been educational, informative, oversimplified, I mean. And obviously if you found these entertaining or informative, then I've done my job, really. And so, without further ado, really, I'd just like to thank you for watching. Again, please go over to support the Oversimplified guys. They do a cracking job, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.
That looks just like...